Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how to sew your own fabric bucket. Fabric buckets can obviously be used to store all kinds of things, but as a knitter I find them ideal to store balls of yarn. Normally these fabric storage buckets are made using the boxing out method, which is the same method that's used to make tote bags with a wider base. However, I wanted to make a truly cylindrical bucket with a circular base, so that's what I'm going to show you how to make today. The reason that most people use the boxing out method is because it's easier, due to only sewing in straight lines rather than on a curve. But I obviously don't like my life to be easy, so today we're going to stick to a circular base. For this project, you're going to need some fabric. You're going to need both outer fabric and lining fabric. I also used a different fabric for the base, although that was mainly because I didn't have enough of the outer fabric. So for the outer fabric, you should choose something with some body, i.e. a bit of sturdiness, such as denim or canvas. I personally chose denim. If you can't use or don't want to use a sturdier fabric, you can instead iron interfacing onto the back of a lighter weight fabric. As for the lining, you should use a lighter weight woven fabric. I personally used a lightweight woven cotton fabric with a polka dot pattern. You'll also need a sewing machine and matching thread. Although if you don't have a machine, it is possible to hand sew the bucket instead. A ruler, some scissors, a disappearing or magic fabric pen, some sewing pins, an iron and ironing board, a rotary cutter and cutting mat if you have them, and a compass and a pencil. Right, so next we need to cut out the outer fabric pieces. For my bucket, I cut out a circle measuring 7 inches in diameter and a rectangle measuring 23 inches by 10.5 inches. The resulting bucket was approximately 7 inches across the base and 9.5 inches tall. You may note that the diameter of the bucket base is the same as the original circle size, even after sewing. This is simply because the base smooshes outwards, which is a technical term, by about 1 inch when in use. So I made sure that it measured 3.5 inches between the point of the compass and the point of the pencil, and then I drew a circle onto my calico. I then cut along that line, and this gave me a circle that was 7 inches in diameter. And then I measured the rectangle shape onto my yellow denim fabric using a ruler and a disappearing fabric pen, and then I cut that shape out as well. If, however, you want to make a fabric bucket a different size to mine, you can work out what size pieces you need by following these steps. First, decide how wide you want the base of your bucket to be, for example 7 inches. Then multiply this amount by pi. So for my example, that will be 7 inches multiplied by pi, which equals 22 inches. You would then add 1 inch to that number. So for my example, that will be 22 plus 1, which is 23 inches. And then for the last step, you decide how tall you want your bucket to be, and then add 1 inch. So for my example, I want it to be 9.5 inches tall, so I add 1 inch to that, which makes 10.5 inches. These steps will give you all the measurements you need. Please note that this is all based on using a seam allowance of 1/2 inch throughout the project. Okay, so the next step involves folding and sewing the rectangle shape. So fold the rectangle in half, widthwise, so that the right sides are facing each other. Then line up the edges and pin the edges together on the opposite side to where the fold is. Sew along this edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I just used a 2.5mm straight stitch on my sewing machine to do this. Remember to remove the pins as you go so that you don't sew over them, and also remember to backstitch at the beginning and the end. And here you can see my stitched line. What you should have now is a tube of your outer fabric. Now we need to make some marks on both of the fabric pieces in order to make sure that we can line them up properly. So fold the circle piece in half and make a mark using a disappearing fabric pen at each end of the fold, like so. Unfold the circle, then fold it in half again, but this time do it so the two marks that you just drew line up with each other. Then make a mark at each end of this fold as well. You should now have a circle with 4 marks an equal distance apart around the edge. Then take your rectangle and make a mark at each end of the current fold. Then refold the rectangle so that this mark lines up with where the sewn ends of the rectangle meet. Mark each end of the 2 new folds that have been created. You should now have 4 marks around each open end of the sewn rectangle. Next, we're going to pin and sew the 2 pieces together. So line up the 4 marks on the circle with the 4 marks on the rectangle and pin the fabrics together at these points. Make sure the right sides of the fabric are facing each other. Then fill in the gaps with more pins so that the outside of the circle lines up with the end of the sewn tube of fabric. And then all you need to do is sew 1/2 inch from the edge all the way around, making sure to remove the pins as you go so that you don't sew over them. The fiddliest bit is keeping the edges lined up and stopping the fabric from all bunching up. As you sew, try and keep the rest of the fabric bucket rotating at the same rate as the base is rotating. The reason for this is that if the base rotates as you sew, but the rest of the bucket doesn't also rotate at the same rate, the fabric twists. This creates creases, which then get sewn over, and then you get tucks or pleats. You'll need to keep straightening the bucket as you sew. I got a few little tucks in the fabric as I sewed, even being careful, so it's tricky to avoid completely. Don't worry too much though, any little tucks will mostly be hidden on the base of the bucket. You then need to follow all of the previous steps, but this time with the lining fabric. So cut out the rectangle and circle shapes, the same sizes as before. Then pin and sew the ends of the rectangle together, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then add the pen marks to line up the edges. And then finally pin and sew the circle onto one end of the tube of fabric. So at this point you should have 2 fabric buckets the same size, one in the outer fabric and one in the lining fabric. Turn the lining fabric bucket right sides out and then put the lining inside the outer fabric bucket. This will mean that the 2 buckets have the right sides of the fabric facing each other. Line up the top edges of both buckets all the way around and pin in place. And even though it's not vital, I also like to have the side seams lined up as well. Then simply sew 1/2 inch from the edge all around the top, except for a gap of about 3 inches that you must leave on one side. As always, backstitch at the beginning and the end. Then turn the buckets right sides out through the gap that you've left. Then push the lining back inside the outer fabric bucket. The top edge will look a bit baggy at this point, so it's best to iron it to make it much neater and to make the fold much sharper. Not only will this make it easier to sew in the next step, but it will also give a more professional finish. Next, where you have the gap in the top edge, fold the fabric edges inside and pin the opening shut. Then add a few pins around the rest of the top edge as well. And then all that's left to do is to top stitch around the top edge. To do this, I used a straight stitch as normal, but this time I sewed 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. And here you can see the sewn line. If you want to display some of the lining fabric, you can then fold over the top of the bucket like so. And that's it, you've now made your own fabric bucket. I really hope you enjoyed this project, and thank you very much for watching.